Good morning. Have we ever heard this story before? I actually think I've preached on it at least 2, if not 3 times since I've been here over the course of my 3 years. One of them was earlier this year. We talked then, I know, it was recent enough I even remember what I preached on. No. I'm going to recap that one and move on to something else. I preached on it earlier this year. We talked about how we tend to focus so much on all the scarcity rather than what we actually do have and what God is going to do with our nothing. It's the second scene in the boat that I think illustrates for us very much the nature of faith, especially faith among us humans. When faced with the nothingness of available food, Jesus provided a miracle of abundance. You would think you would be in awe of that for some time. However, the awe of that miraculous nature of that event doesn't last through the next crisis that the disciples are going to face. Because you think they would have been kind of riding high, figuring, all right, nothing's going to stop us now, we can take on anything, and yet, like 12 hours later, here they are, on the water, being battered by storm winds, and let's not diminish how scary it is to be on the ocean when you're in the middle of a storm, but when Jesus appears, rather than going, oh, awesome, okay, Jesus is here, we're all good, we've got nothing to worry about. They can't believe it's him. They're like, oh, it's a ghost. They can't believe what they're seeing, and therefore they are terrified. Kind of becomes the question, how many miracles does it take to finally believe? Sometimes wonder that. It's like, okay, you get this one, but then maybe you didn't see the miracle the next time or something, and then you don't anymore. We do that, don't we? And then we sit and we wonder, we go, well, gee, why isn't God making all these big miracles? And it's like, well, if you actually look at the Bible, whenever he did miracles, didn't stick with people. Whether it was the Israelites, whether it was the disciples, less than 12 hours later, they've forgotten. Then there's Peter. Now, interestingly enough, Matthew's gospel is the only gospel that tells this part of the story. It's the only gospel that talks about Peter trying to walk on water. Mark's just says Jesus was going to walk on by. he wasn't even going to stop at the boat until he saw they were all scared and terrified, and then he came over to kind of reassure them. John's gospel tells us that the disciples were not only really terrified, but they weren't going to let him in the boat until they finally realized who he was. And Luke's gospel skips the whole story altogether. No walking on water for Luke. So this element of the story is unique in Matthew's gospel. It, of course, has traditionally been a story about how Peter had this really strong initial faith and then he falters because he wavers in the face of adversity. That's probably true, but I think there's something more going on here. Peter says something to Jesus that's very interesting. Lord, if it's you, command me to come out on the water. Lord, if it's you. One of my seminary professors noted that the demand Peter makes here in the Greek is identical to the demand Satan makes during his temptation. If you are the Son of God. Peter and Satan trying to set the terms. I want you to do X for me, Jesus, and I want you to do it the way I say. If it's you, Lord, not entirely sure it's you, command me to come out on that water. Jesus says, okay, come on, let's see how this goes, how that's going to work. Because I think Jesus pretty much probably foresaw the fact that as soon as he ran into a little bit of trouble, he was going to sink. Kind of goes back to the way God dealt with people in the Old Testament, where when they demanded something of God, he said, all right, let's give it a try. Have it your way. I think Jesus is kind of doing the same thing. You want to try and set the terms of how I'm going to come to you, how to behave? Let's see how that works. Doesn't ultimately work that well. Because when we set the terms, we're opening ourselves up to those battering winds that are going to blow us off course in no time, because we've already set an expectation that, well, if I told Jesus to call me out there, he told me to come, surely he's going to make the waves and everything go away, right? When we set the terms, that means we're setting an expectation. How much of our faith is like that? Trying to set the terms. I'll believe if you do this. How often do we try to make Jesus bend to our will rather than the other way around? And how well does that tend to work for us? Instead of accepting that Jesus is the one who is setting the terms on how God encounters human beings. And the problem, to be clear, was not that Peter wanted to jump out of the boat. That was not the issue. I have a sneaking suspicion had he jumped out of the boat and just ran right up to Jesus, he'd have hop-skipped his way across that water with no problem. The problem was Peter was kind of setting it up as a test, as an expectation of what was going to happen once he got on that water. And Peter's test was doomed before he ever stepped out of the boat, because he didn't truly step out in faith. He stepped out wondering about faith. If this is the Son of God, we'll see how powerful he really is. Stepped out wondering, and when the wind began to batter him, when all the things didn't disappear the way he probably thought they should have, well, then he sank. Because wondering about faith isn't what's going to sustain you. Only actual faith can sustain you in the midst of a storm. But I'm grateful for what Peter did here, because it's a good lesson. When you step out in faith, faith is the only thing that will sustain you. Doesn't mean the storm is going to cease. It doesn't mean the waves won't still threaten to overwhelm you. Doesn't mean there won't be things that are thrown your way that are going to try and throw you off track. Simply means that in the midst of those things, clinging to faith is what keeps you from sinking. Now, as a congregation, as a community, when we look at all that we lack many times, when we look at all the things we can't do rather than all the things we can and are doing, well, then we sink. Jesus wants us to get out of that boat. He wants us to come running towards him, no matter what kinds of winds are going to batter us. But I guarantee the winds are still going to batter us. But to step out of that boat, not with the faith of going, well, if this is Jesus. Jesus wants us to take bold steps out of the boat no matter what storms are brewing, what resources are lacking, and meet Jesus on his terms. Because when we meet Jesus on his terms, miracles happen. Miracles happen. And here's the really good news. The really good news is, even if you are Peter, even if you do step out maybe a little too tentatively, maybe you do start to sink, guess what? Jesus isn't going to let you drown. Jesus is still going to pull you up. He is still going to reach in, grab hold of you, and pull you out. Yeah, what does he want? He wants us to have that faith that just boldly pushes forward, that gets out of that boat, runs across that water. But when we don't, when we go a little too tentatively, when we get distracted by the wind and the storms and the things that do threaten to overwhelm us, Jesus is still going to reach in and pull you back out. Let us pray.